To outsiders, Ava and Ethan had the kind of marriage that seemed a textbook example of modern success. They had the modern home in a gated community, thriving careers, and even a golden retriever named Leo whose wagging tail was the perfect punctuation mark. But perfection is a funny thing. It rarely tells the whole story. Ava worked in marketing, a role that offered her a comfortable salary and almost no stress. It was the kind of job people envied, with flexible hours and a corporate culture that practically begged employees to take it easy. Ava, however, found herself restless. Her days felt empty, even in their ease. Ethan, on the other hand, was always busy. A high-flying executive, he spent most of his time traveling between cities, attending endless meetings and closing deals. He came home twice a week, usually late at night, and left before sunrise. It wasn't that he didn't care. He did. Ethan made an effort to call Ava every day, checking in, sending her flowers just because, and making sure she never felt forgotten. But calls and gestures couldn't replace his presence. "I just wish I had more of you," Ava would say during one of their nightly calls, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet longing. "I know, honey," Ethan would reply. "But this job, it's the reason we have this life. If I transfer closer, I'll lose nearly half my income. We wouldn't have the same comfort." "We don't need all this," Ava would argue. "I just need you." But Ethan never wavered. His role, as he saw it, was to provide. And so, the cycle continued. Ava waking up to an empty bed and Ethan calling from hotel rooms, always saying he'd be home soon. Leo, their golden retriever, was Ava's constant companion during these lonely nights. He was there when she sat on the couch, scrolling through TV channels, and when she went on long walks to clear her head. But even Leo's unwavering loyalty couldn't fill the void. Ava began to feel like her life was on pause. She had the job, the house, and even the perfect dog, but what she didn't have was the connection she craved with her husband. It wasn't anger she felt toward Ethan. She admired his work ethic and the life they'd built together. But admiration wasn't enough to stave off the creeping sense of loneliness that had begun to take root. One day, while scrolling through a community board, Ava noticed a flyer for a yoga class. She didn't think much of it at first, but something about the idea of stretching, breathing, and finding some peace of mind appealed to her. Maybe it was the promise of distraction, or the chance to meet new people, or maybe it was the sense of doing something for herself, for once. She decided to give it a try. The yoga studio was everything Ava hadn't realized she was looking for. It was a sun-drenched loft downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the softest, most flattering light. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and sandalwood, and the atmosphere was calm, almost serene. But what truly caught her attention was the instructor. Julian was the kind of serene confidence that made every pose look less like exercise and more like art. His voice was soothing, the kind that made you feel like you could conquer the world or, at least, hold a downward dog for more than 10 seconds. "Welcome," he'd said during Ava's first class, flashing a warm smile that made her stomach do a little flip. "Let's find your center." Ava felt a blush creep up her cheeks as she nodded, uttering a quick, "Thank you," before finding a spot in the back of the room. She wasn't used to being noticed, not like this. The first session was harder than she'd expected. Her muscles ached, and her balance left much to be desired. But Julian's encouraging words kept her going. "Great job," he said at the end of class, giving her a thumbs up. "You've got a natural rhythm." She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so seen. What started as a casual interest quickly became an obsession. Ava began attending every class she could, rearranging her schedule to fit the sessions. It wasn't the yoga she looked forward to, it was Julian. The way he guided the class, the way he made eye contact and smiled just for her, or at least, that's how it felt. At home, Ethan continued his usual calls and gestures, oblivious to the changes in Ava's routine. "How's yoga?" he asked one evening. "It's great," Ava replied, her voice a little too enthusiastic. "It really helps me unwind." Ethan chuckled. "That's good to hear. You deserve some peace." Ava smiled, but her thoughts were far from peaceful. They were on Julian, the way he moved, the way he talked, and the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. The once perfect picture of their marriage had begun to crack, and neither Ava nor Ethan could see just how deep the fractures were becoming. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon when Ava found herself standing in front of the mirror, holding her wedding ring in her hand. The yoga class started in 30 minutes, but her mind wasn't on the poses or the meditative breathing. It was on Julian. For weeks, she had felt herself being drawn to him, not just his looks but his energy. Julian had a way of making her feel like she was the only person in the room, even in a studio filled with other students. His compliments, his light touches to adjust her poses, and his genuine laughter made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Wanted. Ava turned the ring over in her fingers. The weight of it was suddenly unbearable. It was a symbol of everything she and Ethan had built together, but lately, it had started to feel like a chain, tethering her to a life that wasn't enough. Just for this class, she thought, sliding the ring off and tucking it into her jewelry box. I just want to be Ava, not someone's wife. When she walked into the yoga studio, Julian greeted her with his usual warm smile. Ava, glad you made it, he said, his voice as smooth as honey. She smiled back, the weight of her decision already starting to fade. Wouldn't miss it, she replied, her voice a little too light, a little too eager. The class went as it always did, with Julian guiding the group through a series of stretches and poses, his voice calm and steady. But for Ava, every moment felt charged. She noticed the way his hand lingered slightly when he corrected her posture, the way he glanced her way more often than the others. Was she imagining it, or was there something there? As the session ended and the other students began to file out, Ava lingered, pretending to pack up her things. Her heart raced as she rehearsed her opening line in her head. When the studio finally emptied, she saw her chance. Julian, she said, her voice wavering slightly. He turned, his expression open and curious. Yeah, I was wondering if you'd like to grab a coffee sometime? I mean, outside of class. Julian raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at his lips. I like that. You're not like most of my students. Ava laughed nervously, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. What does that mean? You're different, he said, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her stomach flutter. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'd love to get to know you better. The coffee date turned into a long walk through the nearby park, the conversation flowing as easily as the autumn breeze. Ava found herself opening up to Julian in ways she hadn't with Ethan in years. She told him about her job, her love for painting, something she'd put aside long ago, and her desire to find more meaning in her life. Julian, in turn, shared his passion for yoga, his dreams of opening his own studio someday, and his belief in living authentically. You only get one life, he said, his eyes meeting hers. Why waste it on anything less than what makes you happy? His words struck a chord in Ava, feeding into the dissatisfaction she had been feeling for so long. By the time they parted ways, Ava's heart was racing. As she walked back to her car, she caught sight of her reflection in a shop window. She looked lighter, somehow, freer. For the first time in years, she felt like she was waking up from a long, dull dream. But as she drove home, reality began to creep in. Ethan would be calling soon, his voice warm and familiar, asking about her day. Leo would be wagging his tail at the door, and the house would feel as it always did, safe, but hollow. Ava glanced at the empty space on her finger where her wedding ring should have been. She bit her lip, guilt gnawing at the edges of her excitement. This doesn't mean anything, she told herself. It's just coffee, just harmless conversation. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Crossing this line, however small it seemed, was a choice to open a door she might not be able to close. When Ethan called that night, she answered with a smile in her voice, her secret tucked away like the ring she had yet to put back on. How was yoga? He asked, his tone as loving as ever. It was great, she replied, glancing at the clock and realizing Julian was probably still at the studio. I really think it's helping me unwind. Ethan chuckled. Good. I hate being away so much, but I'm glad you found something for yourself. Ava closed her eyes, guilt flickering again before she pushed it aside. Thanks, she said softly. I appreciate that. As she hung up, she leaned back against the couch, her thoughts once again drifting to Julian. Her heart told her this was the spark she'd been craving, but her mind whispered a warning. You can't have both. For now, though, she chose to ignore it. After all, she reasoned, life was about living in the moment. And this moment, this secret, thrilling moment, was hers. Ethan was used to coming home to a quiet house. It was the nature of his work. Long hours and constant travel left little room for spontaneity. But this time, the quiet felt different. Ava was there, sitting on the couch with Leo at her feet, yet the warmth he usually felt when he walked through the door was absent. Hey, he greeted, setting his suitcase down and leaning in to kiss her. She turned her cheek slightly, letting his lips brush against her skin, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice subdued. Ethan frowned, glancing around the room. It looked the same as always, tidy, welcoming. But there was an invisible weight in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "How was yoga this week?" he asked, trying to make conversation as he shrugged off his coat. Ava perked up slightly, her eyes lighting up in a way that didn't go unnoticed. "Oh, it's been great. I'm really getting into the flow of it. Julian says I'm making a lot of progress." Ethan froze for half a second before recovering. "Julian?" "The instructor," she explained casually, though her voice carried a subtle excitement. "He's been really encouraging." Ethan nodded, filing the name away. "That's good. I'm glad you're enjoying it." But later that night, as Ava sat on her side of the bed, scrolling through her phone, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She seemed distracted, her attention slipped away like sand through his fingers. The next few weeks only made the gap between them more apparent. Ava became more invested in her yoga sessions, planning her days around them with a newfound enthusiasm. "Do you really need to go every night?" Ethan asked one evening as she laced up her sneakers. "It helps me unwind," she said with a shrug, avoiding his gaze. "You're always working, so I might as well do something for myself." The comment stung, though Ethan tried not to show it. "I call you every day, Ava. I send you flowers. I try to make time when I'm home." "I know," she said quickly, softening. "I'm not saying you don't care. It's just, yoga is something I can do for me. It's not about you." Ethan forced a smile, though her words stayed with him long after she left. At the yoga studio, Ava felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Julian's attention felt intoxicating, and their conversations after class became longer and more personal. He asked her about her favorite books, her childhood dreams, and her thoughts on life. "What would you do," Julian asked one night, "if you could start over?" Ava hesitated, her thoughts swirling. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Maybe I'd travel more, explore the world." "You should," he said, his tone earnest. "Life's too short to settle." The way he said it made her chest tighten, as though he was offering her a glimpse of a life she didn't know she wanted. Back at home, the tension between Ava and Ethan grew. He noticed the way she avoided his touch, the way her mind seemed miles away even when they were in the same room. "Is everything okay?" he asked one night as they sat on the couch, watching TV. "Of course," she said quickly, though her tone lacked conviction. "You've just seemed distant lately," he pressed. "Like your mind is somewhere else." Ava forced a laugh. "You're imagining things." "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine, and Ethan could feel it. The woman who used to light up when he came home now seemed like a shadow of herself, her attention fixed on something or someone he couldn't see. Ava, meanwhile, was struggling with her own internal conflict. Her time with Julian felt like an escape, a world where she could be carefree and unburdened. But the more time she spent with him, the harder it became to face Ethan. When Ethan called during his business trips, Ava found herself distracted, her answers short and perfunctory. "How's work?" he'd ask, his voice warm and familiar. "Good," she'd reply, her mind drifting to Julian's latest compliment or the way he'd brushed her hand during class. "I miss you," Ethan would say. "I miss you too," she'd respond automatically, though the words felt hollow. The breaking point came one evening when Ethan returned from a particularly grueling trip. He'd planned a quiet dinner at home, hoping to reconnect with Ava, but she barely touched her food, her gaze distant. "Ava," he said finally, setting his fork down. "What's going on?" "What do you mean?" she asked, feigning ignorance. "You're not here," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "Even when you're sitting right in front of me, you're somewhere else. I need to know. Are you happy? Are we okay?" Ava hesitated, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. "I'm just tired," she said weakly. "Work, yoga, everything. It's a lot." Ethan didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Instead, he nodded, his heart heavy with the realization that the woman he loved was slipping away from him. That night, as Ava lay beside him in bed, her back turned, Ethan stared at the ceiling, wondering how they'd gotten to this point. He had always believed their love could withstand anything, but now he wasn't so sure. And Ava, lying awake with her eyes closed, wasn't thinking about Ethan at all. Her thoughts were consumed by Julian, his smile, his words, and the way he made her feel alive. The distance between them wasn't just emotional anymore. It was a chasm, and neither of them knew how to bridge it. Ethan had been looking forward to the gala for weeks. It wasn't just a business event. It was a chance for him and Ava to reconnect, to present themselves as the united team he still believed they were. He'd picked out a sleek black tuxedo and even arranged for Ava to have her favorite hairdresser style her hair for the evening. "Look at us," he said with a grin as they stood in front of the mirror before leaving. "We clean up nice, don't we?" Ava smiled faintly, adjusting her diamond necklace. "You look great," she said, her tone distant. Ethan frowned, but said nothing. He brushed it off as pre-event nerves. The gala was hosted at an opulent hotel in the heart of the city, the kind of place where crystal chandeliers reflected soft light off polished marble floors. As they stepped into the ballroom, Ava took in the sight of elegantly dressed guests mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. For a moment, she felt a pang of guilt. Ethan was proud to have her by his side, introducing her to colleagues and business partners with a warmth that hinted at his deep affection. "This is my wife, Ava," he said to nearly everyone they met, his smile never wavering. But Ava's thoughts were elsewhere. She scanned the room, her stomach twisting when her eyes landed on Julian. He was here. He stood by the bar, talking to a group of guests, his posture relaxed and his smile as charming as ever. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his usual casual yoga attire replaced with something far more striking. Ava's heart raced, and for a moment, she considered slipping away unnoticed. But then Julian's gaze met hers, and she froze. He raised a glass in her direction, his expression unreadable. "Ava." Ethan's voice snapped her back to reality. He was holding out a glass of champagne. "Oh, thanks," she said quickly, taking the glass and forcing a smile. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Fine," she replied, a little too quickly. Ethan didn't press further, but he couldn't ignore the tension radiating from her. As the evening went on, Ava's unease grew. She was hyper-aware of Julian's presence, stealing glances at him whenever she thought no one was looking. But Ethan noticed. He didn't say anything at first, choosing instead to observe the way Ava's gaze lingered, the way her fingers fidgeted with her wedding ring. It all painted a picture he didn't want to see. Then came the moment that changed everything. They were standing near the edge of the room when Ava spotted Julian heading their way. Her breathing quickened, and before Ethan could say a word, she subtly slipped her wedding ring off and slid it into her clutch. Ethan's stomach sank. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he watched as she greeted Julian, her tone light and her smile brighter than it had been all evening. "Julian," she said, her voice tinged with something Ethan hadn't heard in a long time, excitement. "Ava," Julian replied, his tone equally warm. "Didn't expect to see you here." Ethan approached them, his expression carefully neutral. "And you are?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Julian extended a hand, his confidence unwavering. "Julian, I run a yoga studio downtown. Ava is one of my best students." Ethan shook his hand, his grip just tight enough to convey his displeasure. "Nice to meet you." The tension between the three of them was palpable, and Ava seemed to shrink under Ethan's gaze. "Well," Julian said, sensing the awkwardness, "I should get back to my group. Enjoy the rest of your evening." As Julian walked away, Ethan turned to Ava. "I saw you slip your ring off before he came over," he said, his voice low but steady. Ava opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Why?" he pressed, his eyes searching hers. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked away. "I needed to feel like myself again," she said quietly. "Not your wife." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. He took a deep breath, his voice dropping even lower. "Then you're free," he said finally, "to be yourself. Without me." The ride home was silent. Ava kept glancing at Ethan, waiting for him to speak, but he kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched. When they got home, Ethan went straight to the bedroom, pulling a small overnight bag from the closet. "What are you doing?" Ava asked, her voice tinged with panic. "I'm leaving," he said simply. "Ethan, come on. Don't be like this." He turned to her, his eyes hard. "Like what, Ava?" "Like a man who's finally seeing what's right in front of him." She flinched at his words, but didn't respond. Ethan zipped up his bag and slung it over his shoulder. "I've put up with a lot, Ava. My work schedule, the distance, it was all for us, for our future. But this," he gestured toward her, "this is disrespect I can't ignore. Ethan, He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. You've made your choice. And now, I'm making mine." With that, he walked out the door, leaving Ava standing in the hallway, stunned and unsure of what to do next. Ethan drove through the quiet streets, his mind racing and his emotions simmering just beneath the surface. Ava's words replayed in his head. I needed to feel like myself again, not your wife. The betrayal wasn't just in her actions. It was in the way she had disregarded the years of effort, sacrifice, and love he'd poured into their marriage. He wasn't a man to act impulsively. Years in the business world had taught him to channel anger into action, to turn setbacks into strategy. By the time he pulled up to his office, he had already begun piecing together his plan. The next morning, Ethan made a call to the regional manager overseeing his company's subsidiary businesses. I need everything you have on the downtown yoga studio, he said, his voice calm but firm. The manager sounded puzzled. The yoga studio, sir? It's a small operation, hardly worth. Just do it, Ethan interrupted. Send me the financials, lease agreements, and employee contracts. I want all of it on my desk by noon. By midday, a thick folder arrived at Ethan's desk. As he flipped through the pages, his suspicions were confirmed. The yoga studio was part of a larger property portfolio owned by his company. Julian wasn't just a yoga instructor. He was an employee, indirectly working for Ethan's empire. A bitter smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's lips. So, he thinks he can mess with my marriage and walk away unscathed? That evening, Ethan made his way to the yoga studio. He walked in during the final minutes of Julian's last class, leaning casually against the back wall. As the students began to pack up their mats, Julian noticed him immediately, his confident demeanor faltering for just a moment before he approached with his usual charm. Ethan, right? He said, extending a hand. Good to see you again. Here for a session? Ethan ignored the hand, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. Julian glanced around, noticing the few remaining students lingering. Sure, he said, motioning toward the office. Let's step in here. Once inside, Ethan closed the door behind him, his presence filling the small space. I'll cut to the chase. Ethan began, his voice low and measured. You've been spending time with my wife. Julian raised his hands defensively. Look, man, I didn't know she was married at first. And honestly, whatever issues you two have, that's between you. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You knew eventually. You knew, and you kept going. But here's the thing. You're not just messing with me or my marriage. You're messing with your employer. Julian frowned, confusion flashing across his face. What are you talking about? Ethan dropped the file he'd brought onto the desk. This studio. It's part of a property portfolio owned by my company. Which means you're standing in a building that I own. You're my employee, Julian. The color drained from Julian's face as he opened the folder and skimmed the documents. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered. Ethan crossed his arms, his voice cold. I don't joke about my business. Or my marriage. Julian tried to recover, his tone turning defensive. Look, I get it. You're angry. But maybe you should focus on what's happening at home instead of blaming me. Talk to your wife. She's the one who is. Ethan held up a hand, cutting him off. I've already talked to Ava. Now, I'm dealing with you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, tossing it onto the desk. What's this? Julian asked, his voice hesitant. Your termination, Ethan said flatly. Effective immediately. Pack your things and get out. Julian's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew he was outmatched. Ethan left the studio feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about firing Julian. It was about reclaiming control over a situation that had spiraled into chaos. But the hardest part was still ahead. When he got home, Ava was waiting for him in the living room, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. Leo sat at her feet, his tail wagging nervously as if sensing the tension in the room. Ethan, she began, standing as he entered. He held up a hand. Don't, he said sharply. We're past apologies. Ava flinched, but didn't sit back down. Where were you? She asked softly. Ethan ignored her question, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out another envelope. He placed it on the coffee table in front of her. What's this? She asked, her voice trembling. Divorce papers, he said, his tone devoid of emotion. I'm done, Ava. I've sacrificed too much, given too much, for you to throw it all away for a fling. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. Ethan, please. It wasn't like that. I was lonely. You're never here, and I was never here because I was working to give us this life, he interrupted, his voice rising. The house, the trips, the comfort, all of it was for us. And you couldn't even be honest with me. Ava sank onto the couch, her shoulders shaking. I made a mistake, she sobbed. But I love you. I don't want this to end. Ethan stared at her, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and sadness. Love isn't enough, Ava. Not when there's no respect. You've made your choices. And now, I'm making mine. With that, he turned and walked toward the door, Leo following him closely. Ethan, wait. Ava called after him. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. I'll send someone to pick up the rest of my things. Take care, Ava. And with that, he left, leaving Ava alone with the weight of her decisions and the shattered remains of their marriage. The house felt eerily quiet after Ethan left. Ava sat on the couch, staring at the divorce papers on the coffee table, her mind racing with regret and disbelief. Leo, sensing her unease, rested his head on her lap, his eyes full of quiet concern. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Ethan's number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Ethan, please, she said, her voice breaking. Can we talk? I made a mistake. I know I hurt you, but I can't lose you. Please come home. She hung up, her tears falling freely. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done. Ethan, meanwhile, was in a hotel room on the other side of town. He had checked in late, not wanting to face any more questions or confrontations. As he sat on the edge of the bed, he replayed the events of the evening in his mind. Ava's betrayal had cut deeper than he ever thought possible. It wasn't just the act, it was the disrespect, the lies, the way she had chosen someone else over the life they had built together. He glanced at his phone, seeing Ava's missed call and voicemail notification. For a moment, he considered listening to it, but the anger and hurt were still too fresh. He set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The following days were a blur for both of them. Ava tried reaching out to Ethan multiple times, but he didn't respond. She even visited his office, only to be told he wasn't available. The silence was deafening, and it forced her to confront the reality of her actions. She thought about Julian, but the thought no longer brought her comfort. The excitement she once felt had turned into guilt and shame. She avoided the yoga studio entirely, unable to face the memories of what she had done. Meanwhile, Ethan threw himself into his work. He expanded his business dealings, spending long hours at the office and scheduling back-to-back meetings. It was his way of coping, of pushing the pain aside. His colleagues noticed the change in him. He was sharper, more focused, but there was a coldness to him that hadn't been there before. Everything okay, boss? One of his managers asked during a meeting. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. Just handling some personal matters. One evening, about a week after he left, Ethan received a call from his lawyer. Mr. Vance, his lawyer said, Ava has signed the divorce papers. Ethan closed his eyes, the finality of the statement hitting him harder than he expected. Good, he said after a moment. Let's move forward. For Ava, life became a series of small, painful realizations. She noticed the empty side of the bed, the absence of Ethan's laugh, the way Leo would sit by the door as if waiting for him to come home. She tried to focus on work, but even that felt hollow. Her colleagues noticed her distracted demeanor, but she brushed off their concerns. One evening, as she sat alone in the living room, she picked up a photo album from the shelf. It was filled with pictures of her and Ethan, vacations, anniversaries, quiet moments at home. She lingered on a photo of the two of them laughing during a trip to the beach. Her hand instinctively went to her wedding ring, which she had started wearing again, even though it no longer felt the same. I messed up, she whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. Ethan, on the other hand, began to rebuild. He started spending more time with his family and friends, people he had unintentionally neglected during his busy years. His sister, Sarah, was particularly supportive. You've been through a lot, she told him over dinner one night. But you're stronger than this. You'll come out on the other side. He nodded, appreciating her words even if he didn't fully believe them yet. Leo, who had stayed with Ethan, became a source of comfort. The dog followed him everywhere, his loyal presence a reminder that not everything in his life had been lost. About a month after the separation, Ethan found himself walking through a park near his office. The crisp autumn air and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot gave him a moment of peace. As he watched a group of children playing with their parents, he realized something. His life wasn't over. It was different, yes, but it wasn't over. He could rebuild, just as he had in business. And this time, he would build something stronger, something real. Ava, meanwhile, began attending therapy. She knew she needed to understand why she had made the choices she did, to confront the deeper issues that had led to her betrayal. Her therapist, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Miller, challenged her to take accountability. You say you felt neglected, Dr. Miller said during one session. But did you ever express that to Ethan in a way he could understand? Ava hesitated, realizing she hadn't. She had expected Ethan to read her mind, to magically know what she needed without her ever saying it out loud. I didn't, she admitted. I didn't know how to. And Julian? Dr. Miller pressed. Was he about love, or was he about escape? Ava's silence was answer enough. Acknowledging that is the first step toward healing, Dr. Miller said. The next step is forgiving yourself. It was easier said than done, but Ava was determined to try. The day the divorce was finalized dawned gray and unremarkable. Ethan walked into the courthouse with his lawyer, his face calm but his emotions swirling beneath the surface. Ava was already there, seated on a bench in the hallway, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as Ethan approached, her eyes pleading. Ethan, she began softly, but he held up a hand. Let's just get this over with, he said, his tone devoid of warmth. She nodded, biting her lip to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed the agreement, his voice steady as he recited the terms. Ethan would retain the majority of their assets, including the house and custody of Leo. Ava, who had insisted on taking nothing beyond her personal belongings, would move into a modest apartment downtown. When the judge asked if either party had objections, Ava hesitated for a brief moment before shaking her head. No objections, Your Honor, she said quietly. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply nodded when the judge looked his way. Very well, the judge concluded. This court grants the dissolution of marriage. You are now legally divorced. The gavel struck, marking the official end of their relationship. Afterward, Ava lingered outside the courthouse, watching as Ethan walked to his car. She wanted to call out to him, to ask for one last chance, but the words caught in her throat. Ethan, sensing her gaze, turned to look at her. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of 15 years of marriage hanging in the air between them. Goodbye, Ava, he said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. Goodbye, Ethan, she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched him drive away. For Ethan, life after the divorce was a mixture of relief and heartache. The first few weeks were the hardest. The silence of the house felt oppressive, the absence of Ava a constant reminder of what he had lost. Leo became his anchor, a loyal companion who seemed to sense his pain. They went on long walks together, exploring the parks and trails near Ethan's home. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, Leo rested his head on Ethan's knee, his eyes full of quiet understanding. We'll be okay, buddy, Ethan said, scratching behind the dog's ears. One day at a time. Ava's adjustment was even more difficult. Moving into a small, sparsely furnished apartment was a stark contrast to the comfortable home she had shared with Ethan. She spent her days trying to keep busy, volunteering at an animal shelter, attending therapy, and attempting to rebuild her sense of self. One evening, she pulled out a notebook and began writing a letter to Ethan. Ethan, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect you to respond. But I need you to know how sorry I am. You gave me everything, and I took it for granted. I was selfish, and I let my insecurities drive me to make choices that hurt us both. You didn't deserve that. I hope you find happiness, even if it's without me. I will always be grateful for the time we had together, and I will always regret the way I let it end. She folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, but she couldn't bring herself to mail it. Instead, she placed it in a drawer, a symbol of her unresolved feelings. Months passed, and both Ethan and Ava began to find their footing in their new lives. Ethan threw himself into his business, expanding his company's reach and securing several high-profile deals. His colleagues noticed the change in him. He was sharper, more focused, and more determined than ever. You're like a man on a mission, one of his managers commented during a meeting. Ethan smiled faintly. Something like that. But his success wasn't just professional. Slowly, he began to reconnect with his personal life as well. He started spending more time with his sister, Sarah, and her family, enjoying dinners and game nights that reminded him of the importance of connection. Ava, too, found small ways to rebuild her life. Therapy became a cornerstone of her routine, helping her unpack the decisions that had led to the collapse of her marriage. Why do you think you sought validation outside of your marriage? Her therapist, Dr. Miller, asked during one session. Ava sighed, twisting her hands in her lap. I think I felt invisible. Ethan was always so busy, and I didn't know how to tell him what I needed. And Julian? Dr. Miller pressed. Was he about love, or was he about escape? Ava admitted, an escape from the feelings I didn't want to face. Dr. Miller nodded, acknowledging that was the first step toward healing. The next step was forgiving herself. It was easier said than done, but Ava was determined to try. One day, Ava visited the animal shelter where she volunteered and found herself drawn to a timid, scruffy dog in one of the kennels. "This is Luna," the shelter worker explained. "She's been here for a while. Most people overlook her because she's not as flashy as some of the other dogs." Ava knelt down, extending a hand toward Luna, who sniffed it cautiously before leaning in for a gentle pat. "I'll take her," Ava said, smiling for the first time in weeks. For Ethan, the turning point came during a business trip to the coast. He was sitting on the balcony of his hotel room, watching the waves crash against the shore, when he realized he wasn't angry anymore. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed him. In its place was a quiet acceptance, a recognition that he couldn't change the past, but he could control what came next. He picked up his phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Hey, little sister," he said when she answered. "What's everyone doing this weekend? I thought I'd stop by." By the end of the year, Ethan and Ava were living entirely separate lives, but both had begun to find peace. Ethan's business continued to thrive, and he found joy in the simple moments, playing with Leo, spending time with family, and rediscovering hobbies he had long neglected. Ava, with Luna by her side, focused on rebuilding herself. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it with honesty and courage. Their story hadn't ended the way either of them had imagined, but it had taught them both invaluable lessons about love, trust, and the importance of communication. And though their paths might never cross again, they each carried the scars and the strength of their journey, ready to face whatever came next.